Feel free to continue eating, but we're going to, I'm going to be introducing our keynote speaker. We're very, very fortunate to have today with us Alan Gulte. Alan Gulte beats Herman Cohen because Herman Cohen was in the U.S. State Department for only 38 years, whereas Alan Gulte was in the British diplomatic service for 40 years. Well done. Culminating as ambassador to Tunisia from 2004 to 2008. That's a boring country. What could ever happen there? As well as UK ambassador to Sudan, ditto. In addition to serving as ambassador to these countries, he was the UK special representative to the Sudan at two crucial moments. One from 2002 to 2004, during finalization of during negotiations that helped finalize the comprehensive peace agreement that we heard about in Professor Wolf's paper. And again in Darfur from 2005 to 2006. So he was leading the UK delegation to these peace talks, which reached agreements in both cases. There was a comprehensive peace agreement for the North-South Civil War. There was a Darfur peace agreement for Darfur, but the CPA was implemented and the DPA was unfortunately stillborn. In addition to his work in the U.S. and in the British diplomatic service, he's had academic postings, which include a fellowship at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He's also has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and most recently, where I met him, he's been senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he has led a project on peacemaking in Sudan. We've heard a lot from scholars in 3 different fields today, and Ambassador Gulte will now give us a keynote address entitled A Practitioner's Perspective. Alan Gulte.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that very generous introduction. We should perhaps admit from the beginning that a senior scholar at the Wilson Center is a very lowly species. It ranks just above an intern, and I wouldn't be sure about that were it not for the fact that they very kindly provided an intern to help me. It's very good to be in Austin for the first time, from which so many very remarkable people have come. So thank you very much to the university and to Alan for the invitation. I should start with an apology, and that is that I'm not a constitutional expert. I don't pretend to be, but I will inflict more Sudan talk on you. And I know we've had a rich morning on Sudan, and I'm afraid it's going to be a little bit more. A second apology is that I have to leave without listening to this afternoon's sessions because I'm invited, you will not be surprised to learn, to a Darfur workshop at the U.S. Institute of Peace, sponsored, I think, by the Department of State. What it will do, I can't tell you. We just hope it's more positive than some of the previous Darfur efforts I've been involved in. I was struck by one of the conclusions of Ellie's paper for this conference, that scholarly advice for constitutional design in divided societies has generally not been heeded. I thought that was a very interesting, practical conclusion. But if it's so, what are the reasons? Are scholars, you, really too theoretical, impractical, and aloof from the messy realities of conflict? Or are you too often outsiders offering ideal solutions which do not take sufficient account of the interests of the parties engaged in conflict? And those might be summed up as wanting power and/or a greater share of the available resources. Sharing, power sharing and so on, does not come naturally to anybody. One of the problems is that, as the poet Burns said, "The best laid plans of mice and men gang after gley," and they gang a gley because of people, people's ambitions, and events. So I want to come at this from sharing some reflections based on my experience in attempting to help peacemakers in Sudan, and if time permits and your patience allows, we might take a quick look at Arab North Africa, which is an area that has not been covered by this conference, I believe. And the first reflection is an obvious one, like all of these peacemaking things. It's all very obvious. Peace has to be made and owned by the parties to the conflict. Outsiders can help and facilitate, but they can't impose peace. And this is something that we need to repeat time and time again in Washington and elsewhere, when the advocates of something must be done by the American administration are challenged and need to be challenged to say what exactly should be done. And that is much more difficult. I just want, there are plenty of examples both ways in Sudan, but I want just to mention briefly two. One is the aftermath of the Addis Agreement in 1972, which brought autonomy to South Sudan. The Ceasefire Commission was formed by members of the Anyanya and of the Sudan Armed Forces and worked quite effectively, not only in preventing renewed conflict, but in facilitating the integration of members of the Anyanya into the then Southern Command of the Armed Forces. There was no international involvement in that commission. And secondly, the ceasefire in the Nuba Mountains, brokered by Americans and Swiss, led by Senator Danforth, as he was then, in 2002, generated a joint military commission, which did an excellent job of investigating alleged violations of the ceasefire agreement for 3 years. And that commission was formed of the two parties, the SPLA and the government armed forces, with just a few foreigners to see fair play and, as it were, hold the balance. It worked perfectly. The typical patrol was of 3 from each party, plus 1 foreigner who, as it were, chaired the patrol or the mission. They reached out, they supported NGOs, they supported relief work, and were very successful because the parties felt it was our commission. What they did not feel after the CPA was that the peacekeeping forces, UNMISS and in Darfur, UNAMID, were their missions. They were regarded as alien impositions, somebody not taking part, except as outsiders imposing their will. Second reflection is that our interest as outsiders is not who should run Sudan, but how it is run. But the nature of the system adopted obviously influences, if not determines, who runs it. So there's a problem, especially with those who feel that everything the government does is wrong and that the design must try to ensure that they are removed from power, or at least their share of power is very much reduced. That makes it very difficult to get our view across and promote a solution. Allow me to add a few reflections on the CPA process, which we've already discussed. First question, as we've been reminded, and I'm glad that Bill Zartman is here for me to pay tribute to it, is that it was clear for a long time that the North-South conflict was ripe for solution. As soon as I got Sudan as ambassador in 1995, both leaders, Bashir and Garang, when I met him, recognized that no military victory was possible. There was obvious widespread war weariness in both parts of the country. I knew that the parties had talked to each other before. There was an IGAD process temporarily interrupted at the time, and thought they could do so again. And neither had any better alternative to peace talks. So I reported in that sense and said we ought to help a new peace effort. Unfortunately, the timing was not propitious. It was June 1995, and my cable arrived on desks in London at about the same time as the news of the attack facilitated by the Sudanese on President Mubarak in Addis Ababa. The lesson, of course, for me was that you don't have to be right as ambassador, you just have to be lucky. And I was not lucky on that occasion. So it was 7 years before as we've heard already, the interest of outsiders, principally President Bush, in brokering peace in Sudan was revived. The factors for ripeness were still there. What was lacking was a basis for the negotiations. In other words, what were they going to negotiate? What was the target? I was reminded that the first time I saw the late Dr. Garing, in I think 1988 in London, he summed up the hour's exposition he treated us to without interruption. He summed it up by saying Sadiq, who was the Prime Minister of Sudan at the time, says he has a southern problem. I say we have a Sudanese problem. And when it came to January 2002, the Danforth tests were being explored. I went with the then Minister for International Development, Claire Short, to Rumbek, and we saw John Garing and his senior advisors, and he gave us another exposition with Venn diagrams and overlapping circles and so on, expounding his view that there was an African majority in Sudan, not just a Muslim majority, and he could take advantage of that if he had the opportunity. So Claire Short cut through this. I think the professor in John Garing was a little bit upset at this brief interruption, but Claire said, "You mean you want one country, two systems?" Full stop. So he said, yes. So we went back to Khartoum, we saw President Bashir, and Claire said to him, John Garing tells me he wants one country, two systems. What do you think of that? He said, well, sounds all right to me. So that was a basis, and it was the basis of the CPA process was one country, two systems. It had obvious advantages. For Bashir, it moved back the prospect of secession of the South, and for Garing, not only did it coincide with his ambitions, but it enabled him to hold the SPLA together, because there were the Nuba element in the SPLA was always and still is a very important part of the movement, and you don't willingly argue with the Blue Nile leader Malik Agar, who is, I can tell you, a huge man. On one occasion, I was in the car park at Machakos as part of the process. We were trying to get out to the airport before the rather dangerous road was overcome by dusk, and SPLA people, I think it was Dengalo, ran up to me and said, "You can't go." I said, "What do you mean you can't go? I've got a plane to catch." They said, No, you don't understand, you can't go. I said, "Why not?" "Malik is cross." And there in the corner of the car park was Malik, looking like a thundercloud. So it suited Garing. I can tell you without any risk without any hesitation that in 2002, secession of the South was not negotiable. It would not have happened. One consequence of that was that the CPA made no provision for the contingency that Plan B of the referendum would actually come to pass. There was a Plan A. Plan A was that both sides would work to make unity attractive. The arrangements implemented for the interim period of 6 years would be so good that Southerners would forget everything except how much better off they were now than they had been, and they would not take the risks of voting for independence. I may say, incidentally, just as an illustration of the fact that not all these negotiations are as difficult as they look, that 6 years was agreed very quickly. The government came and said it ought to be 10. The SPLA said 2 is quite enough. And the mediators said, how about 6? And they both said yes. And that was the only thing that was agreed in minutes in the whole process. So how far is criticism of the CPA justified? We've heard a bit this morning. It's criticized for not being truly comprehensive, failing to deal with the other problems of the Sudan. Darfur, for example, it's not dealt with the distribution of power and resources within the north and within the south. Opposition parties and militias were not included. The east was ignored, and so on and so forth. That ignores a number of practical points. First, that the chances of success in 2002 were very slim. Claire Short asked me after our exchanges with Garing and Bashir what I thought the prospects were. Will this get anywhere? What are the chances? I said about 5%. She said, oh, as much as that, let's go for it. Sometimes one is lucky in one's minister, more. Sometimes one isn't, but that's another story. Secondly, Sumbewo, who was in charge of the mediation, and the rest of us, found it extremely difficult to encourage and promote negotiations with these two parties. The last thing any of us wanted was to complicate the process by injecting more parties who very likely would have included some with more extreme views on one side or the other. As it was, the talks nearly failed at Machakos in July 2002 over fighting in Torit in September, October of that year, and over a mediation document of July 2003. And neither party wanted to extend the process to others, even their own allies. The SPLA feared that if their allies in the then National Democratic Alliance, northern parties, eastern parties, and so on, were to come, they would turn up they would end by making common cause with the government. They're all northerners and so on. The government did try bringing Martin Kenny and other militia leaders to the process and found that this happened in reverse. Martin immediately made common cause with the SPLA and was inseparable with their leaders, welcomed the chance to get together with them, and completely forgot that he'd been brought along by the government and was supposed to be one of their people. But that said, it was a weakness. These two parties came eventually without mediators to distribute seats and power on their own. And of course, they grabbed far more than I had hoped for, I think most of us had hoped for as observers. We thought that other parties who weren't there would initially, before the election, be allowed 35% of government seats, of parliamentary seats, and so on. It was quite a shock to discover that 18 or so was about all they were going to get. I mean, that's another hazard. Leaving it to the parties is all very well, but the parties grab what they can. I tried with my team to remedy this a little bit in that I felt that I was not needed all the time at the talks. Indeed, most of the time I was not needed at the talks. One of my staff was there. So I spent a lot of time going around to see the opposition inside Khartoum and outside in Asmara, Kampala, Cairo, and indeed in London, and fed in their views and told them what was going on, because they didn't know. Sumbewo had a sort of media blanket on the whole process, and the SPLA were quite good at briefing their cadres on their system, but the government were not. I should say as well, because it comes up all the time, that comprehensive is regularly now misinterpreted. And people start off their critiques by saying, but the comprehensive peace agreement was not comprehensive. It was. But what they meant by comprehensive was that it dealt with all the issues between the government and the SPLA. That is to say that it dealt with the three areas, and it dealt with the SPLA military presence in the east, as well as the issues involving the south. Now, that wasn't easily arrived at, and that's why the comprehensive was justified. Dr. Boone raised the question of could the three areas have been included in the model in the beginning of 2002. The answer is the government wouldn't have had it. They absolutely refused to consider the two areas. They were still wedded to Sadiq's approach, we have a southern problem. These talks are going to deal with the southern problem. And it was a matter of months before we could get them to agree to talk about the three areas in any way. And when they did, it had to be on a different format, because they didn't want to concede the least implication that the three areas could eventually be part of the South. So the format adopted was that Sumbewo chaired, but wearing a hat as a Kenyan representative, not as an IGAD representative. And that fiction continued until there was actually an agreement. I think the next reflection is that this peace agreement, like any, is not just a piece of paper, a treaty, but it's a process, and implementation is crucial. As has been pointed out already, peacemaking is relatively easy. State building is very difficult, not least because that is liable to exclude some claimants or some aspirants to a share of the trough at the expense of others. I used to say during the process that what you're working on is 5% of the task. Whatever the eventual political outcome, you're going to need good relations between Khartoum and Juba. So you must get into the habit of working together. That was disrupted by the death of Garing in a helicopter accident at the end of July 2005. That's what I mean by events getting in the way and disrupting plans. Nobody could have foreseen that. He's a man in perfect health. There was absolutely no reason why he should have been taken from the scene. But it made a real difference, because without his drive and leadership, which was remarkable, the SPLA fell back onto the accommodating the wishes of the majority of Southerners, and indeed themselves, which was to separate from these awful people in the north. So there was no disposition to make unity attractive from the point of view of the SPLA. But that did, in turn, mean that potential divisions arose within the SPLA among those certainly from the two areas, if not Abyei, who very much wanted to stick by Garing's vision. Indeed, somebody from the SPLM North was in Washington last week, and I asked what their policy was, and they said to implement the vision of John Garing. I forbore to say, do you really think the South will come back into one Sudan to oblige you? Of course, they won't, but they don't have a clear alternative. They were cut loose and indeed in many senses betrayed by the majority southern element of the SPLA. So that's a tension one has to recognize, and is a pressure on Salva Kiir, the leader of the SPLA in the South now, who knows that war with the North is a very bad idea for his country, but who has this obligation, moral and personal and political, to support his comrades in arms as were in the North. So with no commitment from on the southern parties, I may say both parties made it very clear that they expected the other to deliver the unity as attractive point. The southern view was, you've been so beastly to us, you must give us more and more and more beyond what's in the CPA. And the northern view was that Garing spoke of unity, you must deliver it. But the relations became adversarial, with no southern interest in making them work particularly well, beyond getting to the crucial point for them, the referendum. And they gave that priority over anything else. So there were problems over the division of ministries, the election laws, the referendum laws, the commissions that had to be formed, and so on. And of course, the provisions for the three areas were not adequate. They were about as good as they could have been in the circumstances, but the negotiators all assumed that it was unity attractive, and we're looking at that context. The context of secession was not addressed, and that was a fault of the negotiators. But as I say, it would have been almost impossible to persuade the government negotiators to take seriously and to look at contingency planning for the process of secession. Then international attention was diverted to Darfur, as we know. One example of the diversion was that in 2003, I started work on the relief of Sudanese debt. We volunteered in the UK to be the sort of friends of Sudan in the process, and we started with meetings of creditors with the World Bank and IMF to give us technical advice. And we learnt that the whole process was going to be very tricky. It required a decent history of good performance by the Sudanese government, and it would require in due course somebody to put up an enormous fund, sum of money as a bridging loan to pay off one lot of debt before they could incur another lot. So we were working on that, and our ministers put a stop to it immediately on the 9th of January, or 10th of January, 2005, because of what was going on in Darfur. With hindsight, I wasn't advising at the time, but with hindsight, that was a bad mistake, because the process was going to take so much longer that it would have been better to keep the threat of interrupting it and not putting up the money that would be needed as a lever over the government in particular, rather than play the card and lose it, because the government just adapted. So we lost 5 years, and as you know, in last year, we started talking again about problems of Sudanese debt and how to deal with it. Could have been dealt with by that stage. That and sanctions in general, this is a parenthesis, if you forgive me, as a practical person, I see it as it evokes memories of childhood visits to the dentist. It was always terrible contemplating going to the dentist. There was likely to be drilling. In those days, we didn't have, at least in England, we didn't have injections to take the pain away. But after you'd finished, you thought, well, it wasn't so bad, and the pain went away, and so on. And that's what people feel with sanctions, most of the time. It's awful in contemplation, but once you've been exposed to it, it's not quite so bad, and you can manage, and you can get your guns from the Chinese instead of the Americans, and all that sort of stuff. Also on the international scene, I want to share with you the experience of the Assessment and Evaluation Commission. This is a body that was set up by the CPA. Its genesis was in some overnight session in the minds of one of the more fertile lawyers on the mediation team, a South African. And he produced this stuff. He used to do his best drafting at 2 in the morning, and he produced this stuff on a stunned observer corps at Machakos in 2002. And it was his attempt to answer the question he'd had from the parties: how do we know that the other side won't cheat? So what he'd done was adapt the sort of Nuba Mountains process I described earlier, created this commission. He said, this is going to be your commission. You will meet together, the two parties. There'll be a few internationals to see fair play, and you will sort out the problems. It was a mechanism for dealing with implementation and verification and so on. The internationals, if I was a typical example, looked at this proposal with horror, because it said, it was very detailed. It said 2 representatives of the 4 IGAD mediating states, 2 representatives of the 4 observers, and 2 others, I think. That would be the international component. And I immediately thought, look, the 4 observers are the UK, the US, Italy, and Norway. You can't perm any 2 from those without upsetting the rest. This is going to be divisive. We'll all look foolish if we start debating it. So we put the whole thing in the freezer and just nodded to Fink Haysom, said, this is a brilliant scheme, Fink. Let's let it go for until the end of the process. By the time we got to the end of the process, of course, when success seemed likely, there came to be far more pressure for people to get involved. This is what happens with the international community. You start with a little troika of ourselves, the Americans and Norway, and then you expand, and the French wanted to be involved, and the Egyptians, never an international process of any sort that doesn't have an Egyptian presence, when I was in Cairo, stationed in Cairo, I discovered that the Egyptians were members of the Barents Sea Fisheries Commission. Absolutely zero interest, but it was a commission and they had to be members of it. So they were being summoned to a meeting of 15 or 20 internationals. I may exaggerate a bit, but a lot of internationals. And they only had about 3 representatives each. So they took no notice of it. They set up their own committee, the NCP, SPLM higher committee, which dealt with the thing. And this mechanism, which could have been very useful, was discarded. And now that's an example, I think, of the international community messing up what might have been a useful component of the design. I think we've probably had enough of the CPA. Let me say very briefly a word about Darfur, but only a word, because I count the DPA, though we got to an agreement, thanks to the brutal negotiating tactics of Bob Zellick, who made no secret of the fact that he treated anger as a negotiating tool, and if he'd actually had something to hit the negotiators with, he would have done so. I think it was getting in the way of Zellick in full flow is bad news, I can tell you. So he managed to get Mini Manawi to sign up, but not the others. Why not? Why didn't the process work better? Why haven't subsequent Darfur processes worked better? Bill will expect me to say, and I will say, that the time wasn't ripe. They weren't ready. And they're still not ready. Some dreamt of military victory. All the movements saw less risky alternatives, because if they'd signed up, one problem, you see, was, for example, there was a discussion of compensation. Abdul Wahid was keen on compensation for every household affected by the conflict. But where do you pitch the compensation? If you ask for $1,000 a household, the next movement will ask for $1,500. So it became too risky for Abdul Wahid to stick his neck out and go for any figure. The government wrong-footed all the negotiators in the Abuja process at least twice by accepting their proposals, because they did want to get this up behind them and have a peace. It was the movements who were divided and unable to take the risks involved. There was one splendid occasion, it must have been late 2005, where there was a document the mediators wanted to get people to accept. I think it was a declaration of principles. And they thought, we're going to have a tremendous amount of difficulty with the government, but the 2 rebel movements will come along with this. It's all, motherhood and apple pie stuff. But the government will be very awkward. So they said, we'll take it to the government first. I mean, the obvious thing would have been to give it to everybody at the same time, but they took it to the government first. And the government said, yes, that's fine. Well, that was a bit of a problem, because they then had to give it to the 2 movements with the instruction that this was take it or leave it. You couldn't amend it, because they didn't want to go back to the government and say, oh, whoops, we want changes. And the rebels, being divided and dreaming of international intervention, were not under pressure to talk. And they did have the recourse of saying no. That was safe. That was easy. And there was no way of pressing them round. And we still haven't found the secret of doing that. Secondly, in contrast to the patience displayed by the IGAD negotiators, who were at it in total for about 9 years, were far too rushed. They were rushed not because of choice, but because there wasn't any finance. The negotiations were being funded by willing donors who dished out the money in 4 or 6 week tranches. So there was always a new financial deadline after which the process would stop. And deadlines didn't work. We didn't have the careful preparation that we'd had through workshops and other devices in the IGAD process, in the CPA process. So the negotiators were unfamiliar with the issues. I mean, they knew their own issues, but they were unfamiliar with the concepts that we would all like to have introduced them to and failed to do. And then the issues were fundamentally intractable. I with great diffidence part company from Alan here, because I think this is one of the cases where there was a climate change driver and other things were relatively unimportant. I mean, the governor of Darfur under the old system had resigned because he couldn't cope with a humanitarian disaster in 1983-84. It didn't lead to violence on that occasion, but there was subsequently. Basically a struggle for land, pasture and water compounded by climate change and environmental degradation. Nobody in the Darfur movements has, I've prodded them myself several times, has come up with any sort of plan to deal with those issues. And their demands, traditional land tenure, well, that's going back to the other lot having the power and those excluded before being excluded again. A vice president from Darfur, well, they've got it, but they didn't like the president's choice. One Darfur authority, that had been tried before, guaranteed share of parliamentary and ministerial seats for us, incorporation of our cadres into the Sudanese armed forces with appropriate salary and rank, and compensation for affected households. None of those would deal with the problems of too many animals and too many people for the land. What one needs is a development plan, including things like a meat processing factory or more than one in Darfur, to use the airstrips that exist, the animals that exist, and export halal meat to the Gulf, who can afford to pay for prompt deliveries of air meat. That's been considered, but it's not on anybody's agenda. It should be. And then you need a provision of basic services. If you educate these people, their possibilities, their horizons are expanded, as you know, and there is more scale. Anyway, that's perhaps beyond constitutional design. It's just my lament that it's very difficult to design anything for people who haven't got the vision to tackle these immensely difficult problems. So what are the challenges today? What are the scope for scholarly advice, if you like? I think it's interesting that both independent countries are now facing the same sort of issues that they tried to grapple with before. In the north, there is the New South, as it's called, conflict in Blue Nile and the Nuba Mountains, barely staved off in Abyei. In the south, of course, there is almost nothing. One has to realize that. It's not a question of talking about a fragile constitutional design. It's a zero constitutional design, and it's all in construction. But they look like constructing precisely the sort of setup that they struggled against. We're used now to say that the problems of Sudan are the center against the marginalized areas, the neglect of the marginalized areas. That's precisely what's going on in South Sudan now. All power and authority, whatever the de jure position about having 10 states, is actually concentrated in Juba. If you're an NGO wanting to work in the far recesses of Upper Nile, you have to have an office and a presence in Juba and be registered in Juba before you can do anything. So it's the general draw of everything to Juba is going to produce and is producing the sort of exploitation of tensions on ethnic and other lines that we've seen before in Sudan. So I think your conclusion on the problems of Sudan is that on South Sudan is that if there's another shock, the place will be hard put to survive, except that it has a shock absorber. Now this is a test for you all. Come on. What's the shock absorber? The American taxpayer. The American taxpayer. Because oil may be cut off at any moment because it's exported through the north. Then you have no income. And the SPLA have been led, rightly or wrongly, to expect that America will support constantly and bail them out. Already USAID are providing $600 million a year for South Sudan. The budget is something over $3 billion. And the SPLA will expect that to be produced from the United States. So there will be another raising of eyebrows then. But pray for no shocks. Huh? In the north, the problems are huge. There are economic problems. The revenue is reduced. There's no government. They need a constitution. They haven't got a constitution at the moment. And they're facing ICC indictments. As you probably saw this morning, a report that from Arabia that the ICC prosecutor is about to target another senior Northern Sudanese, the Minister of Defense, on the grounds that he was the channel for conveying orders from Bashir to Harun to the Janjaweed and so on in Darfur. I've heard the prosecutor speak a week or so ago. He did say that he was planning another indictment, and it seems to me very likely that the Minister of Defense will be a good target. That will make it extremely difficult for those of us who back the ICC to intensify discussions with the government. What one can say about the design in the north is that the de jure position bears absolutely no relation to the practical. The people who matter are the NCP, the army, and the intelligence setup. I was telling somebody the story of a friend of mine who was given a government post and discovered that he couldn't take any decisions because there was a shadow committee in his ministry about which he'd not been briefed, who actually vetted all his decisions, and they'd cancelled the ones he was attached to. So the state institutions are weak. The NCP, the party, is strong. Will they survive? Can they survive a shock? Jury's out, I'm afraid. I haven't got any answers for that. One of the issues when it comes to constitution and the effort to solve all the problems at one fell swoop is how far it creates an Islamic state based on Sharia. And that's a problem not only for Sudan, where it will not be acceptable to a substantial minority in the north, but for most of North Africa, where the opposition to existing regimes is almost, I think in every country, mainly the Islamists, the strongest opposition, and all of them profess to want some degree of an Islamic system, but they do not want to have to deal with the common economic problems that these countries face, problems of youth unemployment and so on. In Tunisia, there's probably the best prospect. Tunisians work together quite well. They've had elections successfully. An interesting point on the Tunisian elections is that though the Islamists won in every constituency, in several constituencies they were beaten by the total of votes for people who didn't get elected. So there is a great scope for consolidating the various opposition and do it. And I can see I'm going to get yanked from the stage any second. In Egypt, I'll leave the others for Q&A if we have time for any, but in Egypt the problem is that the Arab Spring has not produced anything yet. What you have is the army still trying to continue the old system, keep out the Muslim Brothers, and consolidate, entrench their position in new arrangements. So there are great opportunities there. Libya is a blank canvas. Algeria will succumb, no doubt, in due course, for you all to advise, not least advise our friends in DOD on which of these countries is best placed to withstand shocks. But if you're to have any influence, and here is where I come back to answer Ellie's question, over constitutional design and settlements, they'll have to take account of the interests and ambitions of the people contending for power and their almost unlimited ability to pervert even a sophisticated constitutional design. And if you think that's an exaggeration, please remember that I've been in Washington for the last 3 years.